Hello, this is Arun Burathoki reporting for the NB Media Co-op online at nbmediacoop.org. On July 4th, 2022, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, also called CRED-NB, submitted a request to the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change. CRED-NB is a grassroots coalition that advocates for nuclear-free renewable energy in New Brunswick. CRED-NB is questioning the Federal Environment Minister's rejection of the impact assessment for a small modular nuclear reactor on the Bay of Fundy. The minister decided that a federal impact assessment for the ARC small modular nuclear reactor was unwarranted because existing legislation is enough. McAllister says CRED-NB will continue to call for an impact assessment. They will also advise the province to opt for renewable energies rather than nuclear power. Here's what Anne McAllister has to say.
The Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, or CRED-NB, is a grassroots coalition of individuals and businesses and citizen and grassroots groups. And our mission is to advocate for a nuclear-free renewable energy future for New Brunswick. So an energy future that's based on renewable energy, efficiency, storage, and grid interconnections, and that does not use nuclear.
The Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change ruled against a full federal impact assessment for a small modular nuclear reactor proposed by New Brunswick Power at Point Lepreau in New Brunswick. Can you tell us about this, why it was rejected, and what are the impacts?
Okay, well, the minister in his decision letter said that he had decided that a federal impact assessment for the ARC small modular nuclear reactor was unwarranted. And the reason that he gave for that was that he said there was enough existing federal and provincial legislation to address the potential adverse impact of the project and the public concerns and Indigenous rights. That was his decision. We, of course, don't agree with it, but that was what he decided.
Many of us don't understand what is a small modular nuclear reactor. Like, can you, tell us briefly?
Okay, well, a small modular nuclear reactor is a reactor that generates 300 megawatts of electricity or less. So it can be as little as 5 to 10 megawatts, or it can go up to 300 megawatts. So it is small in electrical output, but it's not necessarily small in size or in impact. Okay. And there are worldwide about over 100 small modular reactor designs that are under consideration. In Canada, there were as many as 50. I think now that the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, has 6 or so designs under consideration. That's a lot of competing designs for, one to win out, or 1 or 2 to win out. And it's all part of the fact that these small modular reactors do not exist yet. They are purely computer designed, and they are all very, very different.
What's the impact assessment in relation to this project, and why wasn't IA designated to the SMR?
Okay, well, the reason we applied, we submitted a request to the minister to subject this reactor, this ARC SMR, to a federal impact assessment, because under the current Impact Assessment Act, SMRs of the class, well, SMRs like the ARC that fall below a certain megawatt generation and that are proposed for an existing nuclear risk site, like Point Lepreau, for example, already exists, and the ARC SMR is proposed for that. Those reactors are exempt from an impact assessment. And so as a result, the only way that this SMR could be undergo an impact assessment was for the minister to use his authority under the Impact Assessment Act to designate it, which means that the minister authorizes an impact assessment. It would happen on his authority. So because he did not grant that authorization, we don't have access to this impact assessment process, which we feel is environmentally unjust.
So are SMRs unsafe? And if yes, what are the environmental impacts within the province?
Well, SMRs are, as I say, the SMRs proposed for Point Lepreau, and this one in particular, the ARC SMR, is a liquid sodium cooled reactor. That means that instead of, it's not like the existing Point Lepreau reactor, which uses heavy water, which is water that's chemically slightly different than regular water. This uses sodium. And so what has happened that in the past, there have been large sodium reactors built, one in the UK, one in Germany, a very big one in France, the biggest one in the world in France, another one in Japan. And all of these reactors have had terrible problems. None of them are operating. They have all been shut down. Sodium, I don't know if you remember from your high school chemistry, but sodium is violently reactive with and explodes on contact with air or water, explodes and bursts into flames. And so as a result, there have been a lot of problems with all the sodium reactors with fires and leaks. And so as a result, these large sodium reactors, which were built in the 80s and 90s, have had to be shut down because they have had various leaks, fires, waste explosions. So accidents and malfunctions, potential for accidents and malfunctions, we feel is very real and should be thoroughly investigated. And we believe that the federal impact assessment was the best area the best legislation procedure to investigate this potential. So accidents and malfunctions, we believe, are a risk. And safety, as a result, is a risk. The ARC SMR underwent what's called a vendor design review with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And what that is that's a process where the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, looks at the design and points out problems that need correcting. So one big set of problems that needed correcting were the safety systems. And, ARC was saying, the CNSC was saying that we need more information for this. We need to confirm that this or that will work. And so, as a result, if the CNSC is saying, you have not worked out to our satisfaction, these safety systems will work as you say, then obviously we have concern about safety of them. And then there's the waste issue. The ARC SMR, being a liquid sodium reactor, uses uranium fuel that is enriched, meaning that the existing nuclear reactor uses uranium fuel that is natural. But the ARC SMR, because it is smaller, it needs to use enriched uranium. And that's uranium that has been treated to increase the amount of a particular form of the uranium that is what does the chain reaction. So in order to get more of it so that it can run a chain reaction. So as a result, this enriched uranium fuel is going to, at the end of the reactor, at the end of the fuel load life, which ARC says is about 20 years for a fuel load, then what's going to be done with it? Ultimately, it will have to go into some kind of long-term storage. And so what the government of Canada, well, I should say the agency for the government, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, is working on right now is a deep geological repository, which is basically a big underground set of storage vaults that are, I think the one that's being worked on by NWMO is about 500 meters underground, so half a kilometer. And that is where the waste would eventually have to go. But the problem with sodium fuel waste, or this uranium, which is chemically in a sodium compound, it has to be treated to take the sodium out before it can go into the deep geological repository. Otherwise, as soon as it hits water, and as you know from underground caves, any underground space fills with water sooner or later. It's inevitable. So the waste has to be inert in water. So they have to take out the sodium because the sodium would explode if it were in the underground repository.
Right.
Now, the problem with that is that in the United States, this has been tried by a process in Idaho almost 30 years ago. And the process has been going on for over 25 years. And the process has been an abject failure. It has cost billions. It costs, I forget how many $1 million a year it costs just to keep the fuel safely stored so that it doesn't come into contact with air or water. And so it's this separation, this treatment that hasn't worked. It's the only treatment so far that is known to exist. And yet our problem is that, again, a safety concern, the ARC project so far is going ahead, or is planning to go ahead, without any provision for what the heck they're going to do with this waste at the end of the fuel load's life. It's almost, to me, this is my opinion, as though the industry is saying, the nuclear industry is saying, and NB Power too, as a nuclear part of the nuclear industry, is saying, oh, well, that's a problem, but we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Well, they haven't figured it out in over 25 years. So, you know, we just wanted an impact assessment to have the independent scientific experts look at this and say, look, you know, here are the risks. Do you want to go down this road? Not only the physical and environmental risk, but also the financial liability that you may be incurring to try to deal with this waste for which there currently is no solution. And by the way, the deep geological repository is not designed for this kind of waste. It's designed for can-do waste, for the waste from the typical reactors like Point Lepreau, which is nasty stuff, but once it's in solid form and it's shielded from the public, it is stable. Unlike the ARC nuclear waste, fuel waste, which is, as long as it's in a sodium, combined with sodium, is totally unstable.
Right.
So those are three reasons why we wanted the IA.
Mhm, mhm. So what's the difference between federal and provincial environmental impact assessment? Like you said, uh, the federal EIA is far better than the provincial one. Like, could you tell us, what's the difference between two of them?
Well, I can tell you sort of in the big picture. I'm reading up on the differences right now. So I have just a very basic understanding, but I have noticed a few differences. For one thing, the provincial EIA is a lot shorter. It's maximum 3 years as opposed to the federal IA, which is maximum 5 years. So obviously it has less time, so it can't do as much. It is less comprehensive, and it is my colleagues I know who have had years of intervening in EIA interventions say that it is much weaker. So let me think of another reason that comes to mind. Oh yeah, yes, it's shorter, it's weaker, and it's less comprehensive, less detailed. But the NB government, in its submission during the time that our request for an impact assessment was under review, the New Brunswick government made a submission to the Impact Assessment Agency, which conducts the review, and said that they assured us that the provincial EIA would be what they call a comprehensive EIA, and that's an environmental impact assessment provincial that has public hearings with a chance for public intervention. And that they have assured us that it will also address public concerns as well as Indigenous concerns and rights. The only problem is that there's a significant barrier to participating in the provincial process because there's no funding for interveners, which is what we would be. If we presenting in the process would be called interveners. There's no funding available. You have to do it on your own nickel. And that is a barrier to participation, to public participation. Whereas the EIA, which is a 5-stage process, has public funding for each stage. And the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, for its procedures, its regulatory procedures, has one pot of money for public interveners. So, there's a financial barrier to participating.
Right. Pressure from the nuclear industry lobby changed the federal environmental assessment law in 2019, exempting SMRs below a certain threshold from undergoing a full environmental IA. Is that the reason we are seeing today that the provincial government, has not designated the SMR? What's your thought on this?
Well, that's the reason that the SMR, the ARC SMR, was not automatically eligible for an impact assessment, because back in 2019, when the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act was revised and into the Impact Assessment Act. Pressure from the nuclear industry on the government got the federal government to make an exemption for the SMRs that were below a certain level of megawatt and that were on an existing nuclear site didn't have to go through an SMR. It didn't have to go through an impact assessment. And one thing very shocking about this was that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission was one of the agencies that lobbied for the exemption. Our nuclear safety regulator, whose motto is, "We will never compromise safety," lobbied to have SMRs excused from an impact assessment. We feel that this was a conflict of interest. And as a result, the Assessment Act is flawed.
So is New Brunswick's Clean Environment Act enough to mitigate the impact of SMRs?
Well, the act itself doesn't mitigate the impact of SMRs. What the act does, or the environmental impact assessment, what I understand is that it's going to a comprehensive review. So that means that the proponent will submit a report on the project, describing the project and stating all the great things about the project and all its so-called safety features, even though the project doesn't yet exist, and making the case for why this project is in the interest of New Brunswickers to go ahead. There will be impact. Everybody acknowledges that. But then what happens is after this report is submitted, then it is made available online and in paper copies for public comment. So anybody can go down to the library and get this report, or go online and download the report and read it and comment on it and saying, you know, this is not adequate, this is unsafe, this needs work, or, you know, the proponents that support it saying, we think that, you know, this is safe and it's good for this, that, and that reason. So the public gets to have its say. And then after that, the public comments plus the report go back for review by the Impact Assessment Committee, which I think is called a Technical Review Committee. And they write the final report. They take everything into consideration. They write the final report, and they come up with a recommendation to the minister. The minister has to make the decision to either grant the proposal. In other words, give permission for the project to proceed, give permission for the project to proceed, but with conditions. In other words, the minister might say the project can go ahead, but you need to do A, B, C, D, and E to address these concerns, or to say the project is not in the public interest and cannot proceed. So basically, it's the conditions that are put on the project that are supposed to, quote unquote, mitigate any concerns that are still there, or the minister has decided that what the company or what NB Power proposes to mitigate the environmental harms or impacts are enough.
So
if they deny it, then it's saying that no, this project is not in the public interest, it is too dangerous, or the safety factors have not been adequately addressed. So that's how I understand it works, but my understanding is still pretty basic.
Right. So my last question is, what are the alternatives for ARC SMRs within the province?
Well, the alternatives are renewable and are, first of all, the first thing, and the thing that never gets talked about, is vigorous energy efficiency and energy conservation. Wholesale, vigorous. We've got to retrofit our building stock, you know, and make our whole society, our infrastructure, as energy efficient as we possibly can. Then what that does is that smooths out the energy demand. It lowers the energy demand. Then renewable energy combined with efficiency, existing storage. We have renewable energy sources in New Brunswick. We have tremendous wind potential here. I don't know if you've heard, but the Birchall Wind Farm, which is almost ready to come online now, is here just west of St. John in Warrenville. And that will be a 10 megawatt installation.
Mm.
It has from partnership agreement to when it's scheduled to come online in March of this year, 3.5 years in total, whereas SMRs at least a decade, if ever, because as I say, they don't exist yet. So renewable energy of all kinds. Wind is tremendous potential in New Brunswick. We have existing hydro. We need to negotiate a power purchase agreement with Hydro Quebec. We have this great big hydroelectric battery, enormous reserves in our neighboring province to the north, and they are looking to sell power. So we can negotiate a power purchase agreement with them. Storage technologies are improving apace. We have battery storage, which is coming along rapidly, and which is a decade or so ahead of SMRs in development. Canada is also a leader in other kinds of storage, like compressed air storage and thermal storage.
Mhm.
So storage, pumped water storage as well. We may have some potential for that in New Brunswick. So energy efficiency, renewable energy. We're lucky in New Brunswick in the sense that we're still a small province and we don't use a heck of a lot of power. In 2019, on average, of course, it's gone up. Our population has grown by 25,000, but in 2019, we averaged about 1,600 megawatts use a day.
Okay.
On peak winter demand, on those very cold winter days where it was peak demand, it was 3,300 megawatts a day.
Mhm.
That is not a lot of power. That is manageable. We can do it. We do not need nuclear power.
Mhm.
And have you heard of Chris Rouse?
No.
You know, he'd be worth an interview for you. He, in 2019, he developed a financial plan called an integrated resource plan for NB Power, using NB Power's data. And in that plan, he ran the numbers and said that NB Power could transition to 95% renewable in 15 to 20 years, and phase out nuclear entirely by the end of the reactor's life, around 2040 to 2042. That's when the reactor technically reaches its end of life. And 95% renewable. And he made the wonderful statement that nuclear energy is not the least cost option, and it is far too expensive an option for the last 5%. He said, let's deal with the first 95%, which we can do with renewables and a power purchase agreement with Hydro Quebec and existing storage. Let's do that, and let's do that now. Have time to do it, and let's deal with the last 5% when it comes up.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Well, thank you too, Aaron.
That was Anne McAllister, a spokesperson for the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, CRED-NB. McAllister stressed the importance of renewable energy and argued that SMRs have had problems historically and are not a good choice for the province. The Federal Impact Assessment Agency of Canada responded to questions from the NB Media Co-op with an email statement. The spokesperson said the project is not specifically described in the project list and is therefore not automatically subject to the requirements of an assessment. The spokesperson pointed to a decision from the minister which states that current legislation is enough to deal with potential adverse effects and impacts. You can read the full statement with the article on our website, nbmediacoop.org, along with all our latest articles. For the NB Media Co-op, I am Arun. বুড়াথকে।